how the imagination leads to sin, what the imagination is, and that it produces the same passion as the senses. It is proper now to also comment on the internal sense of the soul, that is, the imagination. Imagination is more refined than sense perception, but more coarse than the mind, and for this reason it stands between the mind and the senses, according to St. Gregory Palamas. The imagination is the map of the ruling mind, about which we spoke in the beginning and upon which everything is recorded. It is the broad board on which things are painted. It is the wax on which things are imprinted. What things? All the things that we see with our eyes, all the things we hear with our ears, all the things we smell with our noses, all the things we taste through our mouths, and all the things we touch through the general sense of touch. According to the wise Vrienios, who borrowed the saying from St. Maximus, the body's world are the external objects, and the mind's are the thoughts. Aristotle called the imagination a common sense because it alone contains all those images, all those sensations and dispositions which have entered from the outside through our five senses. He called it sense because the same passion and movement caused by all the external senses upon the soul is also caused by the imagination alone. In order to prove this fact, many examples are brought forward by the metaphysicians, the physicians, the physicists, and ethicists. I like to present my proof with this example only. Someone eats a lemon. Someone else stands by and sees him, and in seeing him, he thinks that he too is tasting the sharp taste of the lemon, so much so that the taste buds are affected in his own mouth. Now, what is experienced by the observer can be experienced also by someone who is not observing the phenomenon of eating a lemon, but who is affected with a strong impression through the imagination. He who imagines strongly the sensation received by the one eating a lemon imagines himself to be eating a lemon also, and gradually has almost the same reaction in his mouth. There is obviously a very close interplay between the external senses and those of the imagination, which are affected by both one's physical and spiritual capacities. This is the reason why you must guard your external senses from passionate objects, as we said before. At the same time, however, you must also guard the internal sense, that is the imagination, and not permit it to envision, and remember passionate and shameful visions, seen by the eyes, or the improper words heard by the ears, or the fragrances smelled by the nose, or the rich and delicious foods tasted by the mouth, or the soft things touched by the hands. No, for what is the value of guarding the external senses and then not guarding the imagination, which possesses all the passionate impressions of the senses and causes through them the same passion and agitation to the soul? Joseph Vrienios has borrowed a quotation from St. Maximus to express this close relationship between the senses and the imagination. As the body is capable of fornication with the body of a woman, the mind can also fornicate with the thought of the woman through the imagination of that same body. A man imagines in his mind the form of his own body to be united with the form of the woman's body. The same is true with the other sins as well. Those things which the body does actively in the physical world, the mind also does in the world of thoughts. But why do I say that you must guard the imagination as you do the external senses? Actually, we must take greater care in guarding our imagination than our senses. How does the imagination differ from the senses? The external senses are active only when external stimuli are present. The imagination, however, can open its book and reveal its sights and sounds and so forth, even when the perceptible things are absent, and man is alone enclosed within the walls of his home or in a far and isolated place. The imagination is a sort of very fine sense of touch, especially when a certain passion is invoked strongly. In fact, it is often the imagination itself which prompts the external senses to enjoy some imagined passion and thus exercises a sort of influence over them. The imagination, being itself a more refined sense than the external senses, is consequently more rapid in movement, being able in a flash to impress and fashion passionate images of sin, and at the same time to attract the heart to consent. This is why greater care is needed to guard the imagination. St. Maximus said, "To sin in thought is so much easier than to sin in deed, as to wage war in deed is so much more difficult than to do so in thought." St. Basil also spoke about this when interpreting the passage in Job. For Job said, "It may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." The just Job was reasonable in considering the possibility and praying for hidden sin, since men have a tendency to readily fall into the sins of the mind. The activities of the body require both time and opportunity and toil, as well as other persons to cooperate. The activities of the mind, however, are enacted in an instant, without toil, without burden, and every time for them is appropriate to act. The imagination has a certain natural attribute, and all the impressions it receives from the senses, it wants to make them all visible so that it can see, as St. Gregory Palamas has noted. For example, you hear Martha, Sophia. These are two simple sounds which have struck your eardrums, and you have heard them. The imagination is not content to hear them as simple sounds, so it proceeds to fashion even the images of Martha and Sophia, thereby creating greater agitation and passionate pleasure in the soul. By the same token, when you hear kingdom of heaven or hell or anything else that you have not actually seen before, you undergo a certain effort through the imagination to give them some visual form or image. Generally speaking, as we said, the sense of sight sees things substantially. The imagination similarly makes visible what is imagined, and in a sense represents them substantially. This is why imagination instigates a more serious war and a greater agitation. These, then, are the two natural consequences which follow one after the other. Namely, the effort one makes to imagine an object that is absent is the same effort one makes when it is present physically. Conversely, the less one tries to imagine a thing, the less one tries when it is physically present. Oftentimes, the senses receive sense perceptions of things and simply leave them without curiosity. Later, when one returns home, the imagination then remembers and describes with curiosity whatever the senses saw or heard or spoke in passing, and thus creates a greater war and agitation to the soul. The imagination, as soon as it receives and records the image of a beautiful person, can only with great difficulty wipe out that image, as we have noted in the chapter on sight. The things we have suffered are the things we carry around with us through their passionate imaginations, as St. Maximus wrote, and this can happen when we are awake or when we are sleeping. Also, the imagination not only records things, that is, receives images of things seen, but also recalls those images that have been forgotten, fashions other images on its own, which it substitutes for others by adding or subtracting or changing. Thus it can change insignificant images insignificantly, both when we are awake and when we are asleep, through our dreams, in which dreams, I suggest, you never believe. It is written, "For dreams have deceived many, and those who put their hope in them have failed." From this, we conclude that passionate imagination has greater power and authority over man than the senses themselves. Once someone is overcome by a passionate imagination, he becomes altogether subservient to that imagination. Thus, he may not be able to see, even though he has the sense of sight. He may not hear, even though he can hear, neither can he smell or touch. Having all his sense organs open, he appears to have them closed and totally inactive.